Hey y'all, Miss Mayhew here, and I'm going to walk you through the grading rubric for this FRQ practice. Okay, the reason I wanted to make a video is because there are a few things that I want to point out that might not be so obvious if I just were to post the key or the PDF of it. So I'm going to go through this with you guys. This prompt says that the parasite P. falciparum is a causative agent of malaria. P. falciparum cells contain an organelle called the apicoplast. See Figure 1. Apicoplasts synthesize precursors of biomolecules that are required for growth and reproduction of the parasite. So, Part A says to identify one example of a biomolecule that the apicoplast would synthesize for the parasite. So, because this question is an identify question, this is going to be worth 1 point. So, to get that point, you would have to say that the apicoplast synthesizes either nucleic acids, because it has DNA there, so it could make RNA, or it could make proteins. So, that DNA codes for RNA, which codes for proteins. So, saying either of those options would give you the 1 point for Part A. Now, Part B says, for the biomolecule you identified in Part A, draw the monomer. So, if you identified in Part A nucleic acid, you would need to draw a nucleotide. So, a nucleotide consists of 3 main parts. It consists of a phosphate group, a 5-carbon sugar, and a nitrogenous base. So, if you drew this, you would get your point for that. Now, if you identified a protein, you would need to draw an amino acid. So, an amino acid is made up of a central carbon surrounded by a hydrogen, a carboxyl group, an amine group, and an R group. So, if you correctly drew this image, you would be able to get that point for Part B. Okay, this one is worth 1 point because the verb is to draw. You either drew it correctly or you didn't. Okay, Part C says to describe evidence to support your claim that the P. falciparum is a eukaryotic cell. Now, because this is a describe one, this one is going to be worth a few more points. So, this is your opportunity to show the grader you know what you're talking about. This one, though, is a pretty simple, pretty straightforward one. So this one is worth 2 points. The first point would be from talking about the evidence that you see that would support the claim that it is a eukaryotic cell. So you could say something like, there is a nucleus, or there is a mitochondria, or it has membrane-bound organelles. Any of those would give you your first point. Your second point would be from why that evidence supports that it's a eukaryotic cell. So that second point would be from saying that only eukaryotic cells have that thing, whatever it is that you are talking about. Or you could say that those things, or that thing that you were talking about, was not found in a prokaryotic cell. So that's how you could get your 2 points. Part D says based on Figure 1. Now that's super important that it says based on Figure 1. So looking at Figure 1. Describe 2 pieces of evidence a researcher could use to support the claim that apicoplasts evolved from free-living prokaryotic organisms. So this one is a describe. So this one is going to be worth more like the other one. Okay, and we're doing this for 2 pieces of evidence. So this one is going to be worth 4 points. Your first 2 points are going to come from talking about those 2 pieces of evidence that the researcher could use that support the claim that they evolved from free-living prokaryotic organisms. So you could talk about how in that image, you can see that the apicoplast has its own set of circular DNA. Okay, it's important that you point out that the DNA is circular because only prokaryotes have circular DNA. Now, the second point that you could mention from the image is that the apicoplast has a double membrane. So that's where your first two pieces, or your first 2 points come from. Now, because it's described again, we've got to dig into how and why. So your second 2 points would come from how those pieces of evidence support the claim that they were once prokaryotic cells. So, when you're talking about the DNA, you could say something along the lines of, because the apicoplast has circular DNA that's only found in prokaryotic cells, it would have been a prokaryotic cell at one point. Okay, if you're talking about the double membrane, you could say something along the lines of, because the apicoplast has 2 membranes, that suggests that it was engulfed by another cell. The interior membrane coming from the prokaryote itself, and the exterior membrane being part of the vesicle that was formed when it was engulfed. Now, some things about the endosymbiotic theory that you could not use in this example, solely because this question says based on figure 1. There's a lot more evidence to support the endosymbiotic theory, but because we're looking at the figure, some of those don't apply. So, for example, you could not use that the apicoplast divides by binary fission. Okay, even though that is evidence to support the endosymbiotic theory, you can't actually see that in this figure, and that's what the question is getting at. So, that's why that's the main reason I wanted to go through and walk you through this, because I wanted to point out some things that you're not wrong about, but you're not right according to the way that this question is set up. And that's something that you do have to pay a lot of attention to in these AP style questions.